The monitor flatlined at 11:42 a.m. Claire Bennett didn't look up. Her hands were already moving, compressing, adjusting, calling out vitals in a voice so steady it didn't sound human. The patient was crashing, and she was the only thing between him and the floor. That's when the door slammed open. Victor Kane, CEO of Rivergate Medical Center, stood in the doorway in a tailored suit, face red, a billionaire donor at his shoulder. "Bennett, out. Now." She didn't stop. She didn't even blink. "I said out." "He'll die," Claire said. "Give me 4 minutes." Victor's jaw went tight. "You're fired." If this story moves you, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The monitor had been alarming for 37 seconds when Claire first reached the bedside, and in those 37 seconds, she had already cataloged what was wrong. Pressure drop, irregular rhythm, the faint blue tinge creeping into the patient's lips that told her the oxygen sats were falling faster than the numbers on the screen admitted. Room 4 of the Rivergate ICU was a corner unit, 2 windows facing the parking structure, fluorescent lights that hummed slightly off pitch, and the smell of antiseptic that never quite covered the deeper smell beneath it, the smell of people fighting to stay alive. The patient was Gerald Marsh, 61 years old, post-op cardiac bypass, admitted 3 days prior without incident. Claire had been his primary nurse on the day shift since Tuesday. She knew his chart the way she knew her own handwriting. Every medication adjustment, every lab value, the small notation she'd added herself at 6 a.m. That morning flagging a marginal drop in his urine output that the overnight resident had waved off. She had not waved it off. She had watched him through the glass partition every 20 minutes since. When the alarm went off, she was already moving. She had the crash cart pulled alongside the bed by the time her colleague, Danny Reyes, appeared in the doorway. Danny was 2 years out of nursing school, fast and capable, and her eyes went wide the second she read the monitor. "Get me a second line," Claire said, "and page Dr. Forsyth." Danny moved without question. That was the thing about genuine emergencies. They cut through every kind of noise, every interpersonal static, every hierarchy that didn't matter when someone's heart was stuttering toward silence. Claire positioned herself at the head of the bed and made the adjustment she'd been calculating for the last 90 seconds, increasing the IV rate, drawing the medication she needed from memory, hands absolutely still. Gerald Marsh's eyelids fluttered. "Stay with me," she told him. Not loudly. Not the way people said it in movies, desperate and shaking. She said it the way you tell someone which way to turn on an unfamiliar road. Matter of fact, grounded, because you've driven it before and you know it leads somewhere. She was midway through the second intervention when the door opened. She registered the sound but didn't look up. Staff came and went. That was the nature of an ICU. Her attention stayed on the patient, on the waveform on the monitor, on the rate at which the numbers were moving. "Bennett." The voice was wrong for the room, too controlled, too projecting, the kind of voice accustomed to conference rooms and donor galas and places where the acoustics were designed to make one person sound larger than everyone else. Claire's hands continued moving. She placed the line, confirmed placement, began the medication push. "Bennett, I'm speaking to you." "I heard you," she said. "Give me a minute." The pause that followed lasted about 2 seconds. When Victor Kane spoke again, the temperature in the room changed. "I need you in the executive suite. Now. Mr. Holloway has been waiting 20 minutes. She recognized the name. Desmond Holloway, real estate developer, significant donor, the man whose name was embossed on the New Wings signage. She had seen him in the lobby 3 days ago in the company of Victor and 2 board members, everyone performing the particular choreography of people who needed each other's money and were pretending otherwise. "Mr. Holloway is going to have to wait a little longer," Claire said. "This patient is in active decompensation. I don't need a clinical briefing. I need you to walk out of this room." She drew a breath through her nose and held it for 1 second. It was a thing she had learned a long time ago, in places that had nothing to do with hospitals. How to keep your hands steady when someone's voice was trying to make them shake. "With respect," she said, and she meant neither respect nor dismissal. She meant, "I'm doing my job. Mr. Marsh cannot be left without intervention right now. I will come to the executive suite the moment he's stable." A long pause. She heard footsteps. Victor moving further into the room, positioning himself where she could not ignore him without actively turning her back. Which she did, because Gerald Marsh's rhythm was improving by fractions, and she needed to watch the waveform. "You're making a serious mistake." "Possibly," she said. Behind her, she heard Danny slip quietly back into the room with the equipment she'd asked for, and she heard the door held wide for a moment before Danny let it swing shut. In that moment, Claire caught a glimpse of the hallway. Half a dozen people standing there, staff and a visitor or two, drawn by the raised voice that didn't belong. Victor Kane said, "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. If you don't walk out of this room right now, you are done at this hospital." "I understand," Claire said. "Then, I'm not leaving." The silence that followed was absolute. The monitor beeped. The IV pump cycled. Gerald Marsh drew a breath that was slightly easier than the one before it, and Claire watched the oxygen saturation climb. 86, 88, 91, with the specific quality of attention that required everything she had, which was why she did not look at Victor Kane when he said what he said next. "You're finished here." His voice had gone very flat. "Consider this your termination, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." She registered it the same way she registered everything else right now. As information. She noted it, categorized it, set it aside. The saturation was at 93. She needed it at 95 before she could safely hand off. Danny had gone very still against the far wall. "Call Dr. Forsyth," Claire said to her quietly. "Tell him where we are. Stay with Mr. Marsh until he arrives." Danny's voice came out slightly smaller than usual. Are you leaving?" "When he's stable." Victor said something else. She wasn't entirely listening. The monitor said 94. She made one final adjustment, documented it on the interface panel at the bedside, and checked Gerald Marsh's face. Less gray now, the tension around his eyes easing fractionally as his body found a slightly better equilibrium. She held 2 fingers to his wrist for 5 seconds, then withdrew. "Danny," she said, "he needs continuous monitoring. Don't let anyone change the drip rate without Forsyth in the room." "Got it," Danny's voice had steadied. "I got it, Claire." She peeled her gloves off, one, then the other, and dropped them in the biohazard bin by the door. She picked up her badge and her small personal kit from the counter by the door and tucked them under her arm. She took one more look at the monitor, 95, holding, and walked out. Victor Kane was still in the room. He had expected perhaps that she would stop and argue or apologize or say something that gave him something to respond to. She didn't give him any of those things. She walked past him the way she had walked through a dozen places where she was not wanted and was doing necessary work anyway. Without drama, without theater, putting one foot in front of the other until she was through the door. The hallway was worse than she'd expected. There were more people than the glimpse through the doorway had suggested. 2 nurses from the floor desk, an aide, a patient's adult daughter in a visitor badge, and at the near end of the corridor, a man she didn't recognize in civilian clothes holding a hospital visitor's map, like he'd forgotten he was holding it. They were all watching. She had the particular sensation of being the subject of an image that would be described to someone later, with feeling. She kept walking. The elevator bank was at the end of the corridor. She pressed the button for the lobby and stood facing the doors, and while she waited, she became aware, in the specific way you become aware of things when your body is starting to release the tension it held through an emergency, that her hands were very cold. She pressed them together and held them there until the elevator arrived. Tip. The lobby of Rivergate Medical Center was designed to communicate abundance. High ceilings, a water feature against the east wall, real plants in terracotta pots, the kind of lighting that was supposed to feel warm and instead felt expensive. There was a grand piano in the near corner that someone played on Thursday afternoons. The donor wall ran 40 feet along the south side, names in brushed bronze lettering. Holloway at the top, naturally, his name in a slightly larger font than the others. Claire walked through it like she was walking through a train station. She was almost to the main entrance when the dog stood up. She hadn't noticed the dog when she stepped off the elevator. She'd been looking at the exit, calculating the walk to her car, running through what she'd need to do in the next hour. Call her union rep, document everything she remembered from the last 40 minutes, get Gerald Marsh's status through the nursing staff hotline if she could. The dog registered at the periphery of her vision, and then it was no longer at the periphery because it was standing directly in her path, a large Belgian Malinois with a vest she recognized, its attention completely fixed on her. She stopped. The dog did not growl. It didn't move. It simply stood there and looked at her with a quality of focus that she understood, because she had been around working dogs in contexts where they weren't walking greeters in hospital lobbies. The man holding the leash was seated in one of the upholstered chairs near the water feature, one leg extended at an angle that told her something about where the injury was, right knee or possibly hip, the kind of compensation that came from months of managing pain while pretending to be functional. He was wearing civilian clothes, but his posture wasn't civilian. His back was against the chair, his sight lines covered the room, and he'd already looked at the elevator bank twice since she'd stepped out of it, which meant he'd been tracking her before she'd registered him. He was staring at her pocket. Claire looked down. The coin had slipped partially out of the small interior pocket of her scrubs jacket, the one she used for pens and her personal phone. It was a dull brass thing, about the size of a $50, worn enough that the engraving on one side was barely visible. She'd had it for 10 years, and it had moved with her through 3 jobs in 2 states, and she'd never explained it to anyone who'd asked, because explaining it would have required more context than she was willing to give. She closed her hand around it and pushed it back into the pocket. The man's expression had changed. Whatever neutral watchfulness he'd been wearing had gone somewhere else, replaced by something more complicated that he was trying to smooth out. "Hatch," he said. The dog looked at him, then back at Claire, then sat. She met the man's eyes. He said, "Where did you get that coin?" His voice was careful, not confrontational, the kind of careful that came from knowing how much a question like that could unsettle someone. "That's a long answer," she said. "I've got time." He paused. "I'm Commander Ethan Cross. Navy. Sat down here 40 minutes ago because I was told my appointment would take 40 minutes, and I'm starting to think that number was optimistic." She watched him. He was mid-40s, probably, the kind of face that had been outdoors a lot and in difficult light. The lines around his eyes were earned rather than decorative. The dog beside him had the particular stillness of an animal that knew when its handler was concentrating. "Claire Bennett," she said. "I was a nurse here until about 8 minutes ago." Something flickered across his expression. "The commotion upstairs? You heard? The lobby acoustics are better than whoever designed this building intended." A beat. "You stabilized him." "Danny Reyes stabilized him. I got the process started." He nodded once, like that distinction made sense to him in a way that it wouldn't have made sense to most people. "The coin," he said again. She could have deflected. She was practiced at deflecting. The coin had been deflected around for 10 years, carried in a pocket and never spoken of, and she had become very good at the slightly bored expression that meant, "It's nothing, just a keepsake. I found it somewhere." And people believed her because they wanted to and because the alternative was a conversation they weren't equipped for. She looked at Ethan Cross and found that the deflection wouldn't come. "It belonged to someone I served with," she said, "a long time ago." "What unit?" She held his gaze. "You already know what unit." The lobby continued its ambient operations around them. A family crossing toward the elevator bank, a volunteer in a pink jacket helping someone with a form, the water feature doing its thing. Ethan Cross was very still. "He told me you'd be impossible to find," Ethan said. "Told me you were like that you disappeared after, and nobody could—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "Ryan said if I ever found you, I should make sure you had that." The name went through her like a current. She did not let it show on her face, but her hand, still resting over the pocket, tightened. "Ryan Bennett," she said. "Your brother." "My brother." She heard her own voice from a small distance. Ethan Cross looked at his hands, then back at her. "He's been gone 4 years. I was with him when—" Another stop. "There are things he wanted you to know, things that are, as of 8 weeks ago, no longer classified." She stood very still in the lobby of the hospital that had just fired her, next to a water feature and a grand piano and 40 feet of donor names in bronze lettering, and she breathed. "I'll tell you everything," Ethan said quietly. "If you have time." She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, without humor but without bitterness either. My schedule just opened up. He gestured to the chair across from his. She sat. Salmat. His appointment, it turned out, was with the orthopedic department. The right hip, not the knee. She'd been close. And it had been running 40 minutes behind since the moment he'd arrived, which was the kind of institutional dysfunction that felt grimly appropriate given the morning she was having. Hatch settled at Ethan's feet and put his head on his paws, the position of an animal prepared to wait as long as necessary. Ethan told her about the last 4 years in the efficient way of someone who had rehearsed the relevant parts without letting them become a performance. He had served alongside Ryan Bennett, her brother, who had been 3 years younger than her, and who had followed her into military medicine in the specific way younger siblings followed older ones into things, with the particular competitive dedication of someone trying to prove something that didn't need proving. Ryan had gone a different direction than Claire eventually, farther into the operational side, into work that was, as Ethan put it without elaboration, not the kind of thing that appeared on public records. He talked about you constantly, Ethan said, not in a... It wasn't sentimental. He just referenced you. When something worked, or when someone did something right under pressure, he'd say, "My sister would have done it the same way." Like you were the baseline. She had not known this. In the later years, she and Ryan had talked infrequently. The work they were each doing didn't allow for the kind of easy contact that looks normal from the outside, and neither of them had been particularly good at maintenance communication, at the calls that were just checking in without anything specific to report. She had known he was alive by indirect signals, a text from an area code that changed every few months, occasionally a package with no return address, containing something small and useful and characteristically Ryan, no note. And then one day the signal stopped, and 6 weeks later there was a formal notification and a flag and a date. She had not attended the service. She'd been somewhere she couldn't leave. The coin was his, she said. She knew this already, had known it since she picked it up from a package 18 months after his death. No explanation attached. He carried it the whole time. Ethan's voice had gone to a different register, quieter, more careful. He had it on the last mission. He gave it to me the night before, said, he had a sense. Sometimes people do. He said if anything happened, I needed to find you and make sure you had it back. Back, she said. It was mine originally. I know, he told me where it came from. She looked at the coin in her palm. The engraving was of a specific kind, not the standard challenge coin iconography, nothing you'd recognize from public sources. It was a reference to a unit that did not exist in any official records, because officially it had been dissolved in 2011, because officially the operations it ran had been absorbed into other structures, because officially a lot of things that had happened between 2009 and 2014 in areas of the world that official reports described with the blandest possible geographic euphemisms had happened differently than they actually happened. She had been part of that unit for 3 years. She had been 23 when she deployed the first time, attached as a combat medic to operations she could not then and could not now describe in any detail that would be verifiable. She had worked alongside operators whose names she knew and whose faces she did not think about, because thinking about specific faces was the specific thing that made it worse. She had kept people alive in conditions that were nothing like the ICU upstairs, nothing like the clean fluorescent efficiency of Rivergate Medical Center, conditions where the equipment was what you had in a pack and the terrain was actively trying to kill you along with whoever was shooting at you, and you made decisions in seconds that clinicians in hospitals spent conferences debating. She had been good at it. She had been very good at it, in the specific, quiet way that meant she did not receive recognition for it and did not seek recognition for it. And the people who watched her work understood what they were seeing without needing to name it. And then she had come home, and the unit had been formally dissolved, and she had retrained and relicensed and found her way into hospital nursing, which was the most normal version of the only work she knew how to do, and she had been at Rivergate Medical Center for 2 years, and she had been good at that too. Victor Kane had not known any of this. Victor Kane had seen a nurse in scrubs who wouldn't leave a patient's room. He said something else, Ethan told her, the night he gave me the coin. He said that whatever happened, You'd be somewhere doing exactly what you'd always done, keeping people alive. He said he hoped someone was paying attention. She closed her hand around the coin again. The lobby continued around them. Somewhere above, in room 4 of the ICU, Gerald Marsh was either improving or he wasn't, and Danny Reyes was watching the monitor, and Dr. Forsyth had either arrived or he hadn't. The donor wall caught light from the atrium windows. The water feature generated its ambient sound. She was aware, at the edges of the moment, that there was a great deal she needed to do. The union rep, the documentation, the practical mechanics of having been publicly fired and escorted toward the exit. She was aware that she had just lost her income and her access to the work she was by any measure built to do. She was aware that Victor Kane was somewhere in the building feeling whatever Victor Kane felt when he'd made an example of someone. She was aware of all of this, and it was present, and it would require dealing with. But right now she was sitting across from a man who had carried a message for 4 years to give to her, and the message was in her hand. And it weighed nothing and weighed everything, and she sat with it for a moment before she could speak again. The missions he was referencing, she said carefully. The ones where he said, "I know which ones," Ethan said. "I was on 2 of them." She looked at him. He looked back. The kind of look that passed between people who had been in the same category of situation, not the same situation, but the same category, where the air was the wrong temperature, and the light was wrong, and the situation was asking more of you than was reasonable to ask. "You were at the forward operating base," she said. "The one near—" "Don't say it out loud," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved fractionally. "But, yes." She had kept 3 men alive at that location over the course of a 31-hour period in conditions that her brief written after-action report had described, with deliberate understatement, as challenging medical environment with limited resources. One of those men had been Ethan Cross, though she had not known his name then. She had known a casualty number and a wound profile and the specific sound someone made when they were trying to stay quiet about how badly they were hurting. "You were GSW, upper right quadrant," she said. "Tension pneumo developing on the right side. I improvised the chest decompression with what I had in the kit." He touched his right side briefly, unconsciously. "I've still got the scar." Everyone's got a scar from something improvised in a difficult situation. "The point," he said, "is that Ryan wasn't exaggerating when he talked about you, and the people who actually knew what you did over there, they've been trying to find the right way to tell you something that was classified until 8 weeks ago." Her pulse shifted, just slightly. "What was classified?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew an envelope. It was a formal military envelope, the kind with a specific return address, sealed. He held it out. "This was supposed to go to your last known address, but they had an old address. I tracked you down through the nursing license database, which took about a week longer than it should have." She took the envelope. On it, in the return address corner, were letters she recognized. "You should probably open that," he said. She was about to. The lobby doors opened, not the automatic sliding entrance, the formal entrance, the double doors that were pushed open manually and that no one usually used because they required effort. 3 people walked through. They were in uniform. Full dress uniform, navy, and Claire had not seen that specific array of insignia in 4 years, but she knew precisely what it meant, and she sat very still as the lobby, by increments, went quiet around her. The woman at the front of the group walked like someone who had never once in her life questioned whether she was allowed to be in a room. She was silver-haired, her uniform immaculate, the rank devices on her shoulder boards catching the lobby light. Rear Admiral. She was looking directly at Claire. The Rear Admiral stopped 4 feet away and looked at Claire the way people look at something they've been searching for long enough that finding it feels slightly unreal. Claire stood. It was automatic. The kind of thing the body does before the mind has finished processing the situation. The reflex of someone who spent years in environments where a senior officer's presence meant you were already moving. "Petty Officer Bennett," the Admiral said. The title landed strangely. Claire had not been called that in a long time. She had been Claire and Nurse Bennett, and this morning, you, as in you're finished here, but not that. "Admiral Hayes," Claire said, because she knew who this was. The insignia, the bearing, the particular economy of movement that came from 30 years of leading people in difficult situations. She had seen Margaret Hayes twice before, briefly, in contexts that were not on any public record. "At ease," Hayes said, which was slightly absurd given that Claire was in scrubs with a hospital badge clipped to her jacket, but she understood the language being used. It wasn't procedural. It was relational. "I see you as what you were, what you still are." The two officers behind Hayes had stopped a respectful distance back. One was a commander, one a captain, both of them with the posture of people who understood they were present for something significant and were staying out of the way of it. Ethan Cross had risen from his chair. Hatch was on his feet, alert but still. The lobby had gone genuinely quiet. The volunteer in the pink jacket had stopped moving. The family that had been heading toward the elevator was standing near the doors, not quite sure if they should proceed. The receptionist at the main desk was watching with the expression of someone who had just realized the script for this particular shift no longer applied. "I wasn't expecting," Claire started. "No," Hayes said. "You weren't supposed to be. That's part of what we need to discuss." She glanced briefly at the lobby around them, the water feature, the donor wall, the echoing ceilings, and something in her expression tightened. "Is there somewhere more appropriate?" Before Claire could answer, a voice came from the direction of the administrative corridor. "What's going on here?" Victor Kane had returned to the lobby. He was moving with the specific energy of a man who had decided something and was expecting the world to have reorganized itself accordingly. The energy of someone who had just told security to process a termination and had come down to confirm the job was done. He stopped when he saw the uniforms. The recalibration was visible. 1 second of reassessment that he tried to cover with forward momentum and didn't quite manage. "I'm Victor Kane," he said, extending a hand toward Hayes. "CEO of Rivergate Medical Center. Can I help you?" Hayes did not take the hand immediately. She looked at it for a moment with the neutral expression of someone reading a document that hasn't fully surprised them. And then she did shake it briefly, with the courtesy of a person who has decided courtesy is the most efficient option. "Rear Admiral Margaret Hayes," she said, "we have some business with one of your staff." "Former staff," Victor said. He glanced at Claire, and the glance was its own kind of statement. "See how quickly things move," it said. "See how little this changes anything." "We'll clarify that as we go," Hayes said. Victor's expression shifted in a way he probably believed was invisible. "I'm happy to provide a conference room if the Navy needs." "We're fine here," Hayes said. "Wait." It was not, in fact, fine in the logistical sense. The lobby was not a private space, and what Hayes had to say was not, strictly speaking, a public matter. But Claire had the sense that Hayes had chosen the lobby deliberately, the way you choose a location for its witnesses rather than its comfort. Hayes turned back to Claire and held out her hand. In it was a document, not the envelope Claire was already holding, a different one. A formal folder with a classification marker along the edge that had been crossed through with a red diagonal line and stamped declassified in the bottom right corner. 8 weeks ago, Hayes said, the Department of Defense completed a review of certain operations conducted between 2009 and 2015. As part of that review, service records that had been sealed for operational security reasons were reopened and, in some cases, corrected. Claire looked at the folder. She didn't take it yet. "Corrected," she said. "Your record showed an administrative discharge following a medical separation in 2014, Hayes said. That language was chosen at the time for reasons that had nothing to do with your service and everything to do with the classification status of what you'd been doing. It was a cover designation." A pause. "It was inaccurate, and it's been inaccurate for 10 years, and the review corrected it." Beside her, she heard Ethan Cross exhale. A small, controlled sound, like a person who has been holding something for a long time and has just put it down. Claire took the folder. She opened it. The document inside was 4 pages, dense, with the particular formatting of official military records. The specific font, the specific margins, the sequential numbering system. She had filled out enough of these, in field conditions with a headlamp and a pen that kept running dry, to read them quickly. Her eyes moved down the first page, picking out the key language. Reclassification of service record. combat medical operations in support of classified joint task force, multiple engagements resulting in preservation of life, conduct in excess of standard performance criteria. She turned to page 2. There was a list. It was numbered. She counted without meaning to, because the numbers were specific and the specificity made it real in a way the formal language around it didn't. 11 names. Not casualty names. Survivor names. Operators who had been wounded in the field and who had survived, documented now with operational context that had previously been sealed, the medical interventions performed, the conditions, the outcomes. She recognized every situation on the list, though not always the names. Names had been protected in the field, sometimes for operational reasons, and she had worked in conditions where what she knew about a person was their wound profile and their vital signs, and whether they were going to make it. She had not always known who she was keeping alive. She had kept them alive anyway. 11. She had known the number. She had never needed it written down to know it, but seeing it in a government document with a declassification stamp changed something about where it lived in her body. Page 3, Hayes said quietly. She turned to page 3. At the top, in the formal language of military commendation, Navy Cross, approved for award retroactive to service period. She stopped reading. She stopped. Started again. That requires... Secretary of the Navy approved it 6 weeks ago, Hayes said. The delay was the review process. These things move slowly even when everyone agrees they should move faster. Something in her tone suggested personal familiarity with that particular frustration. Claire stood holding the document in the lobby of a hospital that had fired her an hour ago, and she felt not what she expected to feel. Not the clean, uncomplicated feeling of being vindicated, because vindication implied you had been waiting for it, and she hadn't been waiting. She had been working. She had carried the coin and the work and the knowledge of what she'd done, and she had not been waiting for anyone to confirm it. But something shifted anyway. Something that had been held in a specific position for a long time found a slightly different place to rest. She looked up from the document. Victor Kane was still in the lobby. He had not left. He was standing near the edge of the water feature, and his face had done something complicated. The expression of a man recalculating in real time, finding the numbers don't add up the way he'd thought. Hayes followed Claire's gaze. Then she looked at Victor with the particular attention of someone who has just received new information about a room she's walked into. Mr. Kane, she said, you mentioned this individual was formerly on your staff. She was terminated this morning, Victor said. His voice had recovered some of its register. A disciplinary matter. What was the basis? A brief hesitation. Insubordination. She refused a direct instruction from hospital administration. What was the instruction? Another hesitation, shorter than the first but still there. To leave a patient's room. Hayes let the silence exist for a moment. She was very good at silence, the deliberate, weighted kind that made the words already spoken sound different from the inside. She refused to leave a critical patient, Hayes said. The matter involved competing institutional priorities. She refused to leave a critical patient, Hayes said again, not louder, just with less room in it for alternative interpretations. Victor looked at Claire. There was something in the look. Not apology, not quite, but the early stages of a man realizing that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he'd mapped. The termination stands, he said. It came out with less certainty than he'd intended. Claire could hear the intention and the result, and the gap between them. That's certainly your prerogative, Hayes said pleasantly. We'll be in contact with your board. Well, she left the lobby with Hayes and the 2 officers, and Ethan Cross came too, Hatch moving at his side with the ease of an animal that understood group dynamics and had decided Claire was part of this one. They found a family consultation room off the main corridor, small, beige, with chairs that were slightly too soft and a box of tissues on the table that everyone in the room politely ignored. Hayes sat. The 2 officers remained standing near the door. Claire sat across from Hayes, and Ethan settled into the chair in the corner with the particular care of a man managing a hip injury while trying to make it look like he was just sitting down. There's more than the record, Hayes said. I assumed. Ryan's final operational debrief included a full accounting of every mission where your involvement was critical. Hayes folded her hands on the table. He was thorough, more thorough than the situation required. He went back through 7 years of contact records and documented his account of every outcome that he believed was directly attributable to your interventions. Claire breathed carefully. He filed it the week before the last mission, Hayes said, as a supplementary record. He knew the classification review was coming eventually. He'd been pushing for it for 2 years. He wanted to make sure there was something in the file that wasn't just official shorthand. A pause. He was, by all accounts, very stubborn about paperwork. He was very stubborn about everything, Claire said. The corner of Hayes's mouth moved. So I've been told. Ethan, from the corner, aggressively stubborn. It was a lot sometimes. He was 20 years old when I first deployed him, Claire said. She heard herself say it, and the number felt too small for what Ryan had been, but it was true. He had been 20, and she had been 23, and neither of them had been old enough for what they were doing, but age had been beside the point. He used to argue with senior operators about optimal wound packing technique, mid-mission. Did he win? Hayes asked. Twice out of 3. The third time he was technically right, but he'd used a procedure that wasn't in any manual, so nobody was going to admit it. Hayes nodded. The moment passed, and they were back in the beige consultation room with the document on the table and the weight of the morning pressing in from all sides. The reason I'm here in person, Hayes said, returning to the register of official business without making it abrupt, rather than simply having the record correction mailed to you, which was the initial plan and which I overrode, is that the review panel flagged something about your current situation. My employment. Your service record classification, and the fact that for 10 years you have been working in a medical capacity in civilian institutions without access to certain resources and recognitions that you were entitled to and that were effectively sealed away from you by the administrative language used at your separation. Hayes's voice was even. That's a wrong that the department takes seriously, or is attempting to. Claire looked at the document still in her hands. Attempting. We are a large bureaucracy, Hayes said, and there was something almost dry in it. We attempt things slowly and we complete them eventually. She paused. What I'm telling you now, officially and on record, is that your service is recognized, your record is corrected, your commendation is approved, and the Navy would very much like to discuss with you what, if any, formal role you'd be interested in. Advisory, training, consultation, in whatever capacity is compatible with your civilian career. I appear to be between civilian careers at the moment, Claire said. Yes, Hayes said. I noticed. The meeting lasted 40 minutes, and when it ended, Claire walked back into the main corridor of Rivergate Medical Center carrying a document that changed what was written about her in every official place where things were written about her, and she felt strange. Not bad. Not triumphant. Strange the way you feel when something you stopped expecting suddenly happens, and the emotional architecture you built for its absence turns out to not quite fit the presence. Ethan fell into step beside her. Hatch moved between them with the comfortable instinctiveness of a dog who had decided everyone in this group was acceptable. Are you okay? Ethan asked. I'm figuring that out. That's an honest answer. I stopped lying to feel better a long time ago. It's very inefficient. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, slightly surprised by itself. Ryan said that. Almost exactly that. He said you were the most ruthlessly honest person he'd ever met, and it was extremely inconvenient for everyone around you. He wasn't wrong. They reached the main corridor intersection, the one that led left toward the administrative wing and right toward the lobby and straight ahead toward the clinical areas. She stopped because she wasn't sure which direction was hers anymore. Her badge was in her pocket. She hadn't turned it in. In the chaos of the morning, no one had taken it. It was a small thing, a plastic card with her photo and her title and a barcode that led her through security doors. She looked down the corridor toward the ICU. From somewhere in the building, the administrative wing, probably, she heard a voice she recognized. Victor Kane's voice, and with it the clipped, quick voice of someone else, several someones, the rapid exchange of people in a conversation that wasn't going the way one of them expected. The board, Ethan said quietly. Hayes called ahead. She looked at him. Before we came in, he said. She made 2 calls in the car. I only heard half of each, but one of them was to a number that started with the hospital's main exchange. Claire processed this. Hayes had walked into that lobby already knowing more about Rivergate Medical Center than she'd let on in the conversation with Victor, which meant the conversation with Victor hadn't been information gathering. It had been something else, something that needed witnesses. She turned to look at the donor wall, 40 feet of bronze lettering, Holloway at the top. The names of people who had put money into this building in exchange for the particular currency of having their names on the walls of a place where people came when they were frightened and needed help, and who had perhaps expected that currency to buy them more than their name on a plaque. Down the administrative corridor, the voices grew louder, and then a door opened and closed, and there was a specific kind of silence that followed. The silence of a room where everyone had just heard something they couldn't unhear. Danny Reyes appeared at the far end of the clinical corridor, moving fast, and when she spotted Claire, she changed direction without slowing down. "He's stable," she said, when she was close enough not to have to project. "Forsyth got up there 15 minutes after you left. He's stable. They've got him monitored," and Forsyth looked at your intervention notes and said. She stopped, glanced at Ethan and Hatch, recalibrated. "He said the call you made on the medication timing was what kept it from tipping into full arrest." "He would have made the same call," Claire said. "He said he's not sure he would have made it that fast." Danny's eyes went to the folder in Claire's hand, then to the formal envelope still in her other hand that she hadn't yet opened, then to the lobby where the Navy officers were visible through the glass partition, still present, Hayes speaking quietly into a phone. "Claire, what's happening? It's complicated. I have 12 minutes before I need to be back upstairs." So Claire gave her the abbreviated version, not the classified parts, not the specifics, but the shape of it. The service record, the coin, the thing that had been sealed for 10 years and was now not sealed. She watched Danny's face move through a sequence of expressions, each one arriving a half second behind the information that caused it. "Victor fired you," Danny said, "in front of everyone, while you were keeping a man alive. And you're..." She gestured at the document, the lobby, the general configuration of the morning. This whole time what? You were this." Now, Danny said it the way people say things when they can't find a more specific word for the thing they mean. "I was always just doing the job," Claire said. "That's such a you thing to say." Danny shook her head, not in frustration, in something closer to disbelief edging toward affection. "Do you know what's happening upstairs, in Kane's office?" "Approximately." The board chair arrived 20 minutes ago, before Kane was even back up there. She walked in with 2 legal people and an HR director, and she was... Danny paused. "I've worked here for 3 years, and I have never seen anyone walk the way she was walking when she came through that door." Claire looked toward the administrative wing. "There have been other things," Danny said, quieter now. "Before today. The Holloway situation isn't the first time Kane has pulled clinical staff for donor management. There was an incident in February in the ED. I don't know the details, but 2 nurses put in formal complaints and they got moved to different units. A beat. People stopped filing after that." She had not known this specifically. She had known, in the general way that clinical staff always knows, that the administrative priorities of Rivergate did not always align with the clinical ones. She had seen it in the staffing ratios, in the allocation of resources between the new Holloway wing and the legacy ICU unit, in the small ways that institutional culture expressed its real values when no one was explicitly paying attention. She had noted it, and she had done her work, and she had not filed anything, because she had learned a long time ago to pick the fights that were pickable and work around the ones that weren't. "The board is going to want to talk to you," Ethan said from beside her. He'd been quiet during the conversation with Danny, giving it space. "Probably," Claire agreed. "Hayes will have laid groundwork. He paused, choosing words. "She is very good at structural pressure. She doesn't push walls down. She finds the weight-bearing points and applies force there. She seems like someone who's been waiting a while to apply it." 4 months, Ethan said. That's how long the review took once it was approved. She pushed for the approval for 2 years before that. She was Ryan's commanding officer on the last deployment. Claire looked at him. "She was there," he said simply. She was there for the last mission. She knows what he said about you, and she knows what you did, and the last 6 years of her career have had a... She's been advocating for the reclassification review since before most people knew it was possible. He looked at the folder in Claire's hand. That's not just institutional process. That's someone finishing something. She thought of Hayes's face in the lobby when she'd looked at Victor Kane, not anger exactly, but something older and more specific than anger. The look of a person who has watched something be wrong for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where she is permitted to do something about it. She was about to say something. She wasn't sure what, something about Hayes or the record or the 11 names on the list, when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, an internal hospital extension, one she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Bennett," a woman's voice, efficient, slightly hurried. "This is Pauline Marsh. Gerald Marsh is my father. He's in the ICU. The nurses upstairs told me what happened this morning, what you did for him, and I wanted..." The voice caught briefly, recalibrated. "I'm in the lobby. I just arrived. I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted... There's something else. My father is conscious. He's been asking for the nurse who stayed with him. He's asking for you." Claire stood in the corridor with the coin in her pocket and the document in her hand and 11 names in her memory and everything that was either starting or unraveling around her, and she looked at the badge on her jacket, still there, still reading Claire Bennett, RN, ICU. And she made a decision. "Tell him I'll be right up," she said. She ended the call and looked at Ethan, who was watching her with the expression of someone who already knew what she was going to do. "The board can wait," she said. "I know," he said. She was 2 steps toward the elevator when the administrative corridor doors opened and 3 people walked out. Not Kane, not the legal team, but the board chair, a woman named Doris Alterman, who Claire had seen exactly once before, at a hospital-wide meeting, and who had struck her then as someone with a very efficient relationship with what mattered and what didn't. Alterman saw Claire. She stopped walking. "Miss Bennett," she said, "I was just coming to find you." "I have a patient upstairs," Claire said. "Can this wait 20 minutes? Alterman looked at Claire for a moment. Really looked, the way Hayes had looked, the way Ethan had looked. And then something in her expression settled. "Of course," she said. "Thank you." Claire started toward the elevator and then stopped, turned back. The nurses on the floor upstairs, Danny Reyes and whoever else was on that unit this morning. Whatever you're doing with Victor's situation, those nurses should be in a room where they can speak honestly, without fear. Alterman held her gaze. "Understood." Claire nodded once and turned back toward the elevator. Ethan was still standing where she'd left him. Hatch had lain down at his feet with the patience of an animal that was comfortable waiting but was tracking her departure. "You're going back up," Ethan said. "He asked for me." He nodded, something settling in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition. She pressed the button. While she waited for the elevator, she slipped the coin back into her pocket, the familiar weight of it finding its place, and she took one breath of the lobby air, antiseptic and ambient sound, and the distant hum of an institution that was, somewhere in its upper floors, beginning to understand the shape of what it had done this morning. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors were almost closed when she heard footsteps, fast ones, coming from the direction of the administrative wing, and through the narrowing gap she caught a glimpse of Victor Kane in the corridor, his face a controlled disaster, a man who had started the morning believing the day was already decided and was now facing the specific kind of reckoning that didn't announce itself until it was already in the room with you. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. And on the 3rd floor, she was almost certain something was waiting for her that had nothing to do with the Navy or the board or the coin in her pocket. A 61-year-old man in a hospital bed who had asked for the person who had stayed. But the elevator slowed between floors 2 and 3. And when the display ticked upward and the doors opened, what she found waiting for her was not what she expected. The doors opened on the 3rd floor, and the noise hit her first. Not alarms, something worse than alarms, because alarms were expected, were part of the rhythm of a clinical floor, were a sound you calibrated to and moved toward with purpose. This was voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, with the specific pitch of controlled panic failing to stay controlled, and underneath it the sound of a gurney moving fast over tile, and the squeak of shoe rubber and someone calling a name in the corridor with more urgency than a name was usually called. Claire stepped off of the elevator and read the floor in the 2 seconds it took to orient. The ICU was to her left. The voices were coming from there, not from room 4 where Gerald Marsh was, but from room 7 at the far end of the unit, where the curtain was half drawn and 2 nurses were moving with the compact, deliberate speed of people managing something that had just changed on them. A crash cart was already positioned at the door. That was good. That meant someone had seen it coming, or seen it start and reacted fast enough. She didn't make a decision. She was already moving. The nurse nearest the door was Thomas Kwan, a solid ICU nurse she'd worked alongside for 8 months, and he registered her presence without the brief confusion she might have expected from someone who'd just heard she'd been terminated, which told her either the news hadn't reached this unit yet, or Tomas had already made his own calculation about what mattered right now. "What have we got?" she said. "Post-surgical day 2, aortic repair. BP dropped 15 minutes ago. We adjusted, it came back, then 5 minutes ago it dropped again, and this time it's not responding." He was already pulling equipment as he spoke, the 2 tasks running parallel without interfering. He's 68, warfarin history, Dr. Gaines is 3 minutes out. Rhythm? Sinus, but rates climbing, sat at 91 and trending. She was inside the room. The patient, a compact, gray-haired man she didn't know, the chart on the wall reading Devereaux, Arthur, was pale in the specific way that meant the blood was working hard to stay where it needed to be and losing the argument. His eyes were open and tracking, which was something. "Mr. Devereaux," she said, positioning herself where he could see her. "I'm Claire. I'm going to be right here." "Feels..." He stopped, tried again. "Feels wrong." "I know, we're fixing it." She didn't elaborate. People in acute distress didn't need elaboration. They needed the truth delivered with enough steadiness that it functioned as ballast. She had learned this in conditions where the alternative was someone losing the psychological grip that was keeping them cooperative, and a panicking casualty was a casualty you couldn't treat. She assessed fast. Skin color, the quality of the respiratory effort, the way his hands were positioned, slightly clenched, the left one more than the right, which combined with the post-aortic repair history and the pressure behavior suggested something specific. She looked at the monitoring leads, then at the surgical site dressing visible above the blanket line. "When was the last time this dressing was assessed?" she said. Tomas checked the chart. "Shift change, 4 hours ago." 4 hours. She looked at the dressing. The edge closest to the right side was darker than the rest. Not dramatically, not the obvious bright hemorrhage that would have been caught at a glance, but the particular slow-soaking darkness of something that had been happening gradually long enough to become a problem. "We need to look at this site," she said. "Get me a second set of eyes on the dressing before Gaines gets here." Tomas moved. The second nurse, a younger woman Claire recognized but couldn't immediately name, was managing the IV line on the other side of the bed. The room was tight and organized, and everyone in it was working, which was the best possible version of a bad situation. The next 6 minutes were the kind of 6 minutes that couldn't be compressed or summarized afterward without losing the texture of them. The specificity of decisions made in real time with incomplete information, the small corrections and adjustments that didn't look dramatic from outside, but were the actual substance of keeping someone alive. Dr. Gaines arrived at minute 4, assessed what Claire had found in 30 seconds, and made 2 calls that were both correct and slightly slower than the situation wanted, which was not a criticism of Gaines. Gaines was a good surgeon, but was the reality of being the person who had to make the call and own it afterward. Arthur Devereaux stabilized at minute 11. Not completely, not finally. Stabilized as in the numbers stopped their descent and held, as in the situation moved from active crisis to managed concern, as in the people in the room could take a breath and not be gambling while they did it. Gaines looked at Claire across the bed. He was a deliberate man, not given to effusive statement, but something in his expression carried what he wasn't saying. "The dressing observation was the call," he said. "Another 20 minutes and we'd be in a different room having a different conversation." Tomas would have caught it, she said. Maybe, he might have. He paused. I heard about this morning. It's been a morning. Kane's in the boardroom. He said it neutrally, without visible satisfaction, but the neutrality was doing some work. Has been for the last 40 minutes. Alterman called an emergency session. She noted this without response, pulled her gloves off, and checked on the dressing one final time before stepping back to give the room to Gaines and his team. Tomas was already updating the monitoring documentation. The other nurse was cleaning up the peripheral materials. The room was resetting itself, the way clinical spaces did, absorbing crisis, returning to function. She found Danny in the corridor outside room 4. He's been awake, Danny said, asking every 10 minutes. How is he? Stable, improving. Forsyth's happy with the numbers. A pause. Pauline is in there with him, his daughter. Danny looked for a word. She's very grateful and also very upset on your behalf, and I may have given her more information than was strictly appropriate. How much information? Enough that she made a phone call about 20 minutes ago. I don't know to whom. Danny looked slightly uncomfortable with this. She asked me for Kane's name and his title, and I told her. Claire absorbed this. Okay. I shouldn't have. You didn't do anything wrong, Claire said. And she meant it, though she also understood that Pauline Marsh making a phone call with Victor Kane's name in her hand could go several directions, some of them more useful than others. There was nothing to do about it now. She pushed through the door to room 4. Gerald Marsh looked worse than the numbers on the chart suggested, and better than he'd looked 3 hours ago, which was the particular paradox of someone who had come close to something bad and was now aware of how close they'd come. His color was off. The gray-yellow of post-crisis, post-adrenaline, post-whatever your body does when it almost stops. But his eyes were clear, and they found her immediately. There she is, he said. His voice was rough. Mr. Marsh. She came to the chair beside the bed. How are you feeling? Like I had a bad morning. He watched her. They told me you stayed. I did my job. They also told me you got fired for it. His jaw set. While you were doing it. She didn't confirm or deny. It wasn't information he needed to manage his recovery. Don't worry about that, she said. Bit late for that. The woman on the other side of the bed, Pauline Marsh, mid-30s, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, Claire guessed, though she'd never met the mother, was watching Claire with a focused intensity that was different from gratitude. It was the intensity of someone who had made a decision and was checking whether the decision was sound. I called a reporter, Pauline said. Not apologetic. Informational. Pauline, her father started. A friend. She covers the health beat for the Ashford Register. She's been looking at Rivergate for 6 months. Staffing practices, patient outcomes, a complaint that was filed in February and then went nowhere. Pauline's eyes stayed on Claire. She needs a name, someone who experienced it directly. And I need to know if you're willing. The room was quiet enough that the monitor's slow beep was audible in the space between sentences. Claire looked at Gerald Marsh, who was watching her with an expression that was not pressure, that was, if anything, asking her to make the choice that was actually hers to make without his need for justice getting in the way of it. She thought about the 2 nurses in February, the complaints that went to a unit transfer instead of an investigation. The way institutional silence maintained itself not through active conspiracy, but through the accumulated small decisions of people who needed to keep their jobs. Tell her to call the nursing staff directly, Claire said. Danny Reyes, and she should talk to the ED nurses who filed in February. She'll need to find them, but if she's been covering this beat, she probably already has names. And you? Pauline said. I'll talk to her. Claire paused. Not today. Today I have things to do here. Pauline nodded, something releasing in her shoulders. She spent 15 minutes with Gerald Marsh, which was about how long his stamina allowed before the effort of conversation began to show in his vitals. She answered his questions honestly, deflected the ones she couldn't answer, and when his eyes started to lose their focus, she told him to sleep and meant it. And he did, with the trust of someone who had learned in the last 6 hours that this particular person's word was reliable. Now, in the corridor outside, Tomas was waiting for her. Gaines wants you to know, he said, That as far as he's concerned, you're still staff. Informally. He said, a slight pause. He said if security tries to pull your badge, come find him. She looked at the badge on her jacket. I'll keep that in mind. Also, Tomas lowered his voice, not because they were near other people, but because the information seemed to require it. There's something going on in medical records. IT was up there an hour ago, and then legal was up there, and then the two of them left together and medical records locked down. I heard from Jesse in the ED that someone requested a full audit of patient placement and staffing assignment records going back 18 months. She had not known this was happening, but she'd known it was possible. Had known, in the abstract way that you know about the weight-bearing structures of a building you've been working in, that if someone started looking at the right places in Rivergate's institutional history, they would find things that were not correctly calibrated, and that finding them would require the kind of documentation review that was difficult to conduct quietly. Who requested the audit? She said. The board chair, Tomas said. Alterman. That meant the board had found something in the last 2 hours that had expanded the scope of their concern from this morning's incident to something larger, which meant either Hayes had given them more information than she'd indicated, or the board had been looking for a reason to look more closely, and the morning had given them that reason, or both. Tomas, she said, the February incident in the ED. Do you know the nurses who filed? He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much to say and concluding that the moment had arrived where it was better to say it. One of them is still here, Naomi Varga. She's on nights, ED. The other one, Priscilla Park, she left Rivergate in April. She's at Harmon Memorial now, across the city. Someone from the register may call them. Good, Tomas said without hesitation. She moved through the rest of the floor with the specific efficiency of someone who had temporarily set aside every personal concern and was operating on the narrower logic of what needed to happen right now, in these rooms, for these patients. She checked in with the nurses managing 2 other complex patients, made 2 observations that she communicated to the covering resident, who was young enough that he might have bristled at it from some people, but who absorbed it from Claire with the practical attention of someone who understood she was offering, not correcting, and completed the medication reconciliation on a patient whose primary nurse had been pulled to cover the Devereaux room during the crisis. It was administrative work mostly, the kind of work that wasn't visible in the way that the dramatic interventions were visible, but that kept patients from falling through the gaps that existed between the dramatic moments. She had always been better at this part than she was given credit for, because it was quiet and it was thorough, and neither of those qualities drew attention in institutions that measured worth by different metrics. She was in the medication room running a reconciliation when the door opened and Hayes walked in. Not alone. One of the officers from the lobby was with her, the commander, who stayed in the doorway while Hayes stepped inside and closed the door to the degree that it would close without latching, which was a hospital medication room door, so it closed most of the way. There's a development, Hayes said. Claire set down the chart she was holding. Alterman's board review has moved faster than expected, Hayes said. They found irregularities in staffing records going back 14 months. Specifically, the records show a pattern of reassigning senior clinical staff away from high acuity patients during periods when VIP donor engagement was scheduled. She paused to let that be what it was. It wasn't coincidental. There's a scheduling protocol, informal, not written anywhere official, but consistent, where certain nurses, specifically the ones most likely to push back on administrative intrusions into clinical space, were systematically routed away from donor-visible areas during events. Claire heard this with the particular sensation of something you'd suspected being confirmed. It was not satisfying exactly. It was the feeling of a shape you'd seen from a distance, resolving into its actual form. How many incidents? She said. 14 documented so far. The audit is ongoing. Hayes looked at her steadily. You were flagged in 6 of them. Not today. Dating back to your first month on this unit, you were moved or scheduled around on 6 separate occasions in ways that don't correspond to any stated clinical rationale. I thought my scheduling was unusual, Claire said. I couldn't prove it. Now it's provable. Hayes's tone was even, but there was something underneath it. The specific quality of a person who has spent a long time building toward a moment and is now inside it and is refusing to let herself accelerate into it recklessly. There's more. The February complaints, Varga and Park, they went to Kane's office. He forwarded them to HR with a notation that characterized them as interpersonal disputes rather than patient safety concerns. HR closed them on that basis without investigation. They got moved, Claire said. Varga was moved. Park resigned under conditions that legal is now characterizing as potentially coercive. A beat. The board has engaged outside counsel. Kane has been formally suspended pending investigation. Not removed yet, but suspended, effective as of 40 minutes ago. Suspended. Not fired, not escorted out in the way he had escorted her out. Given the procedural distance of suspension, the same institutional cushioning that the institution had not extended to Claire or Varga or Priscilla Park. She noted this without surprise and without the particular bitterness that would have been available to her, because bitterness required energy, and the energy was going other places right now. What does outside counsel mean for the nurses who filed? She said. It means their complaints are being reopened and reviewed under independent investigation. It means their accounts will be formally documented and considered. Hayes paused. It means someone is finally listening in a room that has authority to act. Claire looked at the medication chart in her hands. A patient's name, a medication schedule, the specific unremarkable work of keeping someone's chemistry in a functional range. There's one more thing, Hayes said. She waited. Desmond Holloway called the board this morning. Hayes watched her face. When he heard about the incident, the specific incident, that Kane had terminated a nurse mid-resuscitation to make his appointment, he withdrew his current funding commitment, effective immediately. The lobby. Holloway at the top of the donor wall, the name in larger font than the others, the wing with his name on the sign. His office issued a statement, Hayes continued, citing concern about patient care standards. His attorney made clear that the Holloway wing naming rights are contingent on the hospital meeting certain standards of care which are defined in the original gift agreement. A pause. Kane was apparently unaware that clause existed. The silence in the medication room was very specific. The silence of a structure that had been relying on certain foundations, discovering that the foundations were not where it had believed them to be. He's going to lose everything, Claire said, not with satisfaction, with the flat precision of a statement of fact. The investigation will determine that, Hayes said, but the trajectory looks clear. She set the chart down on the counter. She needed a moment to think, and Hayes was giving her the room for it, standing quietly near the door with the patience of someone who had waited much longer than this for things to move in the right direction. She was thinking about Priscilla Park at Harmon Memorial across the city, about Naomi Varga on the night shift in the ED downstairs, about the 14 documented incidents and the people who had been on the clinical end of each one, who had made the decision to say something or not say something and had lived with that decision. She was thinking about Ethan Cross in the lobby downstairs with his hip injury and his 4-year-old message and the coin that was back in her pocket where it had lived for 10 years. She was thinking about the specific moment this morning when she had peeled off her gloves and walked out of Gerald Marsh's room and through the watching hallway, and she had felt, in some precise interior location, something that was not defeat, not even close to defeat, but was the low-grade weight of yet another place where the institution's version of reality and the actual reality were not aligned, and the institution was going to win the argument about which one counted. She had been wrong about that. The board wants to meet with you, Hayes said. Today, if possible. Alterman specifically asked. I know, Claire said. She told me. Are you prepared for that conversation? She picked up the medication chart again, made the notation she needed to make, replaced it in the rack. Prepared was not exactly the word. She had not prepared for any of this morning. She had arrived at work at 6 a.m. and noted an anomaly in a patient's urine output and watched his oxygen saturation through the glass partition and done her job. I'll be ready in an hour, she said. Hayes nodded. She was about to leave when Claire said, The nurses upstairs, Tomas Kwan, Danny Reyes, the ones who stayed and kept working through this whole morning, whatever recognition comes out of this investigation, whatever structural changes the board makes, Those two need to be part of any conversation about what this floor should look like going forward. Hayes looked at her. Noted. I mean formally noted, in writing. Then formally noted. The corner of Hayes's mouth moved. In writing. Hayes left. Claire stood alone in the medication room with the chart in her hands and the hum of the refrigeration unit and the muffled sounds of the floor outside, and she thought about what Alterman would ask her, and what she would say, and how much of it would matter in the long sequence of steps between a suspended CEO and an actual change in how this place worked. How many gaps there were between a board emergency session and a patient in a bed being treated by a nurse who was adequately staffed and properly supported and not being routed around the schedule to accommodate someone's donor management. She thought about all of that, and she thought it clearly, without the softening of optimism or the distortion of anger. And then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered it because she had been answering unknown numbers all morning, and at this point the caution of screening felt beside the point. Is this Claire Bennett? A woman's voice, direct, with the particular vocal register of a journalist, practiced neutrality that didn't quite cover the alertness behind it. It is, Claire said. My name is Sasha Wren. I'm with the Ashford Register. I've been asked by Pauline Marsh to— I know who you are, Claire said. I told Pauline I'd speak with you. I want to be upfront about something, Sasha said. Before we talk. I've been covering Rivergate for 6 months, and I've been hearing about a pattern for most of that time, but I didn't have someone willing to speak on record. I still have a lot of pieces that don't connect. A pause. And then this morning happened, and 3 separate sources reached out within 2 hours. Okay, Claire said. I can come to the hospital, or we can do this by phone, or I can meet you wherever— Come here, Claire said. Give me 90 minutes. Come to the main lobby. She ended the call. The door to the medication room opened, Danny, slightly breathless, in the doorway. Claire? Something in her voice. You need to come to the floor. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong with the patients. Danny's expression was complicated. Not alarm, not quite. Kane is upstairs. He came up the back stairwell about 10 minutes ago. He's in his office, his former office, and he's been in there with 2 people from the admin team, and the door is locked, and facilities just told me that someone remotely accessed the medical records server from that office in the last 15 minutes. Claire stood very still. What files? She said. That's the thing. Danny's voice dropped. It's not patient files, it's employment records. Specifically. She stopped. Specifically, Claire said. Specifically, the complaint files. The ones from February. The ones legal just reopened this morning. Danny met her eyes. And yours. Your entire personnel file. She was moving before Danny finished the sentence. Not running. The floor didn't allow running. And drawing that kind of attention right now would accomplish nothing. But walking with the specific purposeful speed that clinical staff learned to read as something is happening and it requires movement without the surrounding panic that made situations worse. Danny kept pace beside her, the 2 of them moving through the corridor toward the administrative stairwell access at the far end of the unit. How long ago did facilities flag it? Claire said. Maybe 5 minutes before I came to you. Jesse from IT called down to the floor desk because the access came from Kane's office terminal, and IT had already been told by legal that the terminal was under administrative hold pending the investigation. Danny's voice was tight but controlled. They remotely locked the terminal. But Jesse said the session had been running for at least 12 minutes before the lock executed. And in 12 minutes, you can move files, Claire said. Delete them. Copy them to an external drive. Or email them, Danny said. Or anything. She thought about the complaint files. Varga's account, Park's account, both of which legal had just reopened this morning, both of which contained specific documented allegations about the way Kane had handled patient safety concerns raised by clinical staff. Her own personnel file, which contained every performance review, every scheduling notation, every documented interaction she'd had with administration in 2 years. If those files were altered or deleted before the independent investigators accessed them, the board's case would have significant gaps. Not insurmountable gaps, there were other records, there were the people themselves who could testify, but the kind of gaps that made timelines harder to establish. that introduced ambiguity where clarity was needed, that gave lawyers enough room to work. He knew that. Whatever else Victor Kane was, he was not slow. She hit the stairwell door and went up. The administrative wing on the fourth floor had a different texture from the clinical floors, quieter, carpeted, the sounds of the hospital muffled by the material choices of an environment designed to feel more like an office building and less like a place where emergencies happened. It was empty in the way of a floor that had been abruptly disrupted. A workstation with a coffee cup still steaming beside it, a door that had been left half open, a copier midway through a job that nobody had come back for. Kane's office was at the end of the wing, corner unit, the door closed. The light was on inside. She could see it under the door. She did not go to the door. She went to the office 3 doors down, which belonged to the chief operating officer, which was unlocked, and which had a shared wall with Kane's corner office, along with the desk phone that all administrative offices had, networked through the hospital's internal system, which had an intercom function that most people never used, and that Claire knew about because she had, in her first month at Rivergate, accidentally activated it while trying to reach the pharmacy line. She picked up the phone and pressed the intercom code for Kane's extension. There was a pause. Then the intercom opened. She said, "Victor, I know you're in there. It has already locked the terminal and logged the session. Everything you accessed in the last 15 minutes is in their access log." Silence from the intercom. The particular silence of a person recalculating. "The complaint files are backed up on the hospital's off-site server," she continued. "Legal had them flagged and mirrored this morning when they reopened the investigation. What you're looking at on that terminal is a copy. The originals are already with outside counsel." This was partly true. She was confident of the backup protocol, less confident about the timeline of Legal's actions, but she said it with the flatness of someone who had checked and was reporting. The bluff was not performative. It was a tool. She heard, through the shared wall as much as through the intercom, movement. Voices. Not Kane's voice, 2 other people, the admin team Danny had mentioned, speaking in low, urgent registers. Then Kane's voice, close to his own intercom. "You have no standing to make any demands in this building." "I'm not making demands," she said. "I'm telling you what's already happened. What you do in the next 30 seconds is your decision." Another silence. Longer. She put the phone down and walked to the stairwell door at the end of the corridor and held it. She was not entirely sure what she expected to happen. She had made the call because it was the available option, and she had taken it, and she was prepared for it to have no effect, for Kane to stay in that office until security physically removed him, or for whatever he'd accessed to already be past the point where her intervention mattered. The corner office door opened. Victor Kane came out first, and the 2 people behind him were not, as she had assumed, mid-level administrators. One was a man she didn't recognize, 50s, in a jacket that was slightly too formal for a hospital visit, and the other was Rivergate's general counsel, Marcus Fry, who had the expression of a man who had spent his career in the service of institutions and had just watched one of them make a decision that was going to cost them both significantly. Kane saw her standing at the stairwell door and stopped. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet of carpeted administrative corridor, and in that distance there was everything that had happened since 11:42 a.m. The ICU, the lobby, the brass names on the donor wall, and the uniform in the doorway, and the document in her hands, and Arthur Devereaux's blood pressure, and the coin in her pocket, and 4 years of a message that had finally arrived. Kane looked older than he had this morning. Not in any dramatic way. Not haggard or broken, just the specific aging that happens to people when the structure they've been standing inside suddenly reveals itself as thinner than they believed. He still had the jaw, the posture, the suit, but the suit was doing less work now. "The board is waiting for you," she said. "Alterman specifically." Kane said, "This isn't finished." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." And then she held the stairwell door open, and she waited, and after a moment he walked past her and through the door, followed by the man in the formal jacket, and Fry, who did not look at her as he passed. She let the door close and stood in the empty administrative corridor for a moment with the steaming coffee cup and the midway copier and the fluorescent quiet, and she breathed once, deliberately, through her nose. Then she went back to work. The board meeting convened at 2 o'clock in Conference Room A on the second floor, which was the largest conference room Rivergate had, and which was not, it turned out, large enough for the number of people who had a reason to be in it. Doris Alterman sat at the head of the table with the body language of a woman who had spent the morning making decisions she had not anticipated needing to make, and was still making them without visible fatigue. Flanking her were 3 other board members, outside counsel, a firm Claire didn't recognize, brought in by Alterman directly, and 2 representatives from the State Department of Health who had arrived at some point in the last hour, which told Claire that the board's actions had already crossed the threshold from internal review to regulatory notification. Hayes was present at the far end of the table. The commander was beside her. Ethan Cross was in a chair near the wall. Not at the table, just present, Hatch at his feet. The quiet weight of someone who had driven the message this far and was seeing it land. Sasha Wren from the Ashford Register was not in the room, but she was in the building. Claire had seen her in the lobby when she came down, a compact, watchful woman with a tablet and a press credential, who had the particular stillness of a journalist who knows that the story is developing and that patience right now is more useful than noise. Claire sat at the table, to Alterman's right, and the meeting began. What followed was not, in the cinematic sense, a confrontation. It was documentation. It was the slow, methodical process of formal record, statements given, records reviewed, the IT access log presented and analyzed, the staffing pattern data that the board's rapid internal audit had produced, laid out in tables that said clearly, in the language of numbers rather than testimony, what had been happening for 14 months at Rivergate Medical Center. She gave her account of the morning without embellishment, because embellishment was not something she was inclined toward, and because the facts, in their bare sequence, were already sufficient. The alarm at 11:42, the intervention, the instruction to leave the room, her refusal, the termination, the stabilization, the walk to the lobby. She answered 12 questions, each one specific, each one followed by a notation that outside counsel made on a tablet. She did not editorialize, she did not perform. At some point during the review of the staffing pattern data, one of the board members, a man named Greer, who had been in the pharmaceutical industry for 20 years before the board appointment, said, "This is not a rogue actor. This is a system." No one disagreed. By 4 o'clock, the investigation had acquired the particular momentum of a process that had found solid ground. It was moving now with its own weight, requiring less pushing and generating its own direction. The Department of Health representatives had opened a parallel inquiry. Outside counsel was in contact with the attorneys for Priscilla Park and had begun the process that would eventually result in a settlement, though that was weeks away yet. The IT forensics team was documenting the records access from Kane's terminal, and what they found there was not, as it turned out, a deletion. It was something that took Claire a moment to process when Alterman told her. He had been copying files out, not destroying them. Specifically, he had been copying personnel files and complaint records to an external account that, when IT traced it, belonged to a domain registered to a private law firm in a city 3 states away. Outside counsel looked at this information with the expression of someone seeing a shape they recognize. He was building a defense file, Alterman said. He intended to use those records, characterize the complaints as a pattern of difficult employees, establish a narrative around performance concerns, using our files, one of the DOH representatives said. Not quite a question. Our files, Alterman confirmed flatly. Hospital records, transferred without authorization to private legal counsel, before his suspension was formally processed. She paused. Marcus Fry signed the outside counsel retainer for Kane's personal representation at 10 this morning. The room was quiet. Fry knew, Claire said, not accusatory, factual. Fry knew enough to have him in that office, Alterman said. What exactly he knew and when is part of the investigation now. Marcus Fry, she learned later, had left the building at 3:15 without speaking to the board. His office phone went to voicemail. By 5 o'clock, he had been formally placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She found Ethan in the second-floor corridor at 4:30, Hatch walking in slow circles on the end of his lead because they'd been inside too long. He looked tired in the way of someone managing pain through a long day and not mentioning it, which she identified because she had looked like that before and recognized it in other people. You need to sit down, she said. I've been sitting most of the day. You need to sit down and put your leg up, she said. That hip is going to give you grief tonight if you don't. He looked at her. Are you nursing me right now? Occupationally hazard. She found a chair from the alcove near the elevator and set it in the corridor beside the wall and looked at him until he sat in it. And he did, with the slightly grudging gratitude of a person who needed to be told to rest and was glad someone had done it without a lot of conversation about it. She sat on the windowsill across from him. Outside the window, the parking structure and the late afternoon sky, and the ordinary geography of Ashford City, traffic moving, people walking, the world not aware that anything particular had happened in this building today. Hayes is briefing the board on the commendation, he said. I know. They're going to want to do something public, a ceremony. He paused. I know that's not your preferred mode. No, she said. But it's not about my preferred mode. He looked at her. If what happens publicly matters to the nurses who filed complaints and got moved, she said, then what happens publicly matters. That's the only calculation that counts. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Ryan would have made that exact argument, in almost that exact word order. She looked at her hands. He was a better version of the argument, she said. He believed it all the way down. I believe it most of the way down, and then there's a piece at the bottom that's just stubbornness. I think that's true for most people worth knowing, Ethan said. Hatch put his head on her knee without being invited. She looked down at the dog, who was looking up at her with the uncomplicated attention of an animal that had made a decision about a person and was committed to it. She put her hand on his head. What happens to you now? She said to Ethan. Hip surgery, probably. 6 months of recovery. He said it without self-pity, but also without the fake lightness that people used to pretend difficult things were easy. And then we'll see. The Navy has you for longer? 2 more years if the hip cooperates. Then, he stopped. Then I figure out what I'm for outside of it. He said it with the careful honesty of someone who had been thinking about this for long enough that the thought no longer alarmed them, though it still had edges. That's a real question, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere above them, the ICU was doing what it always did. The monitors, the medications, the nurses moving from room to room with the ordinary, extraordinary work of keeping people alive. Arthur Devereaux was probably sleeping. Gerald Marsh was probably watching the room with the alert eyes of a man who had nearly stopped existing and was finding the world more interesting for it. I need to go back upstairs, she said. I know. She took her hand off Hatch's head and stood, and the dog made a small sound of mild protest, and then accepted the situation and looked at Ethan. Claire. She was already 2 steps away when he said it. She turned. He was right, Ethan said. Ryan, he said you'd be somewhere doing exactly what you'd always done, and he hoped someone was paying attention. A pause. Someone was. She held that for a moment. Then she turned and went back to work. The evening edition of the Ashford Register's digital publication ran a story at 6:47 p.m. under Sasha Wren's byline, headlined, Rivergate CEO. Suspended amid patient safety probe, Navy commendation sheds light on terminated nurse. It was careful, well-sourced, and specific. It named the February complaints and the inadequacy of the HR response. It documented the staffing pattern data in language clear enough to be followed by a reader with no medical background. It described what had happened in the ICU at 11:42 a.m. in precise terms. It noted, toward the end, that Claire Bennett had been awarded the Navy Cross for combat medical service spanning multiple classified overseas operations, and that her military service record had been sealed until 8 weeks ago by classification requirements. It did not editorialize. It didn't need to. By 7:15, it had been shared 1,400 times. By 8 o'clock, Rivergate's Public Relations Department had issued a statement confirming the board's emergency review and the suspension of the CEO pending investigation, which was the kind of statement that institutions issued when the story had moved faster than their damage control infrastructure and they needed to be on record as responding rather than concealing. The statement made no mention of Claire by name. The story did. Amat. She was in the medication room on the third floor at 8:30, charting, when Danny appeared in the doorway. Victor Kane gave a statement, Danny said, to the TV news, outside the building. Claire set down the chart. He said the termination this morning was procedurally valid and that the board's investigation is politically motivated. He said, Danny looked at her phone, reading, the characterization of my leadership as prioritizing donors over patients is a fundamental misrepresentation by individuals with personal grievances. Okay, Claire said. He mentioned you by name. She waited. He said, Danny scrolled. He said your military background gives you a certain profile that certain people find compelling, but profile is not the same as performance. And the decisions I made today were based on this nurse's established pattern of disregarding administrative authority. The room was quiet. The refrigeration unit hummed. What's your pattern? Danny said. For the record. Prioritizing patients, Claire said. Right. Danny put her phone in her pocket. That's what I thought. Claire finished the notation she'd been making and closed the chart. Through the small window of the medication room, the corridor outside was in its evening mode, slightly slower, the harshest light of the day having given way to the fluorescent constancy of night shift prep. In an hour, the shift would change, and the overnight team would arrive and the floor would go through its nightly reconfiguration, and the patients would still be there in their beds and their rooms, needing what they needed, and the work would continue the way it always continued regardless of what was happening in boardrooms and press statements and administrative corridors. The story was running now. The investigation had its own momentum. The board had the records and the outside counsel and the Department of Health and the unstoppable weight of documented evidence. And Victor Kane was standing outside the building giving television statements. She went back to the floor. At 9:15, the night shift charge nurse, a veteran named Walt Prescott, who had been on this floor for 11 years and who was one of the most reliable people she had ever worked alongside, came to find her at the nursing station. Board wants you back in conference room tomorrow morning at 9, he said. Alterman's office called down. Okay. Also, he said it the way Walt said most things, without preamble, the words and the subtext presented simultaneously. I heard what happened this morning. I heard all of it. He looked at her steadily. I've been here 11 years and I've filed 3 complaints about this administration's approach to clinical staffing. All 3 went nowhere. A pause. I put my name on a 4th one this afternoon. Gave it to the DOH directly. His voice was measured, but there was something under it that had been there for a long time and was now coming to the surface. I wanted you to know. She met his eyes. Thank you, Walt. He nodded once, the economy of a person who had said what needed to be said, and went back to the handoff briefing. What? She left the hospital at 10:40 that night, which was later than she had intended, and later than was technically appropriate given that she was not, as of this morning's termination, on the schedule. She had stayed because there was work, and because the work was where she knew how to be, and because leaving felt like a concession to the morning's events that she was not yet prepared to make. Her car was in the parking structure, 2nd level. She took the stairwell rather than the elevator. Out of habit, 11 years of working in various hospitals had given her the specific habit of choosing stairs over elevators when she wasn't on a clinical floor, the same way it had given her the habit of noting exits and the general habit of situational awareness that she'd carried since before nursing, since before Rivergate, since the time in her life that the document in her jacket was now the official record of. She was on the landing between levels 1 and 2 when she heard the door above her open. She kept walking. Ms. Bennett. She stopped. The man on the landing above her was not Victor Kane. She had half expected Kane, had been half braced for some version of that encounter in some location before the day was finished, but this was the man she'd seen leaving Kane's office. 50s, formal jacket, the one she hadn't recognized. He was standing 2 steps above her on the stairwell landing, and he was alone, and his hands were in his jacket pockets, and his expression was the carefully composed neutrality of someone who had rehearsed an approach. I represent Mr. Kane, he said, informally at this stage. We wanted to have a conversation before tomorrow's board meeting. She looked at him. The parking structure was concrete and fluorescent, and the hour was late, and she was tired in the specific way of a person who had been running on controlled adrenaline for 12 hours and was now feeling the bill come due. She was also, underneath the tiredness, very clear. "You can contact me through the hospital's HR department," she said, "or through the union. Either is appropriate. What we'd like to discuss," he continued as though she hadn't spoken, "is a settlement framework. Mr. Kane is prepared to acknowledge that this morning's termination was procedurally premature and to offer reinstatement with compensation in exchange for—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "Whatever he's prepared to offer in exchange for whatever he wants me to do with my statement or my participation in the investigation? The answer is no." She said it without heat, without anger, just the plain shape of a closed door. "If you continue this conversation without my representation present, I'll report it to outside counsel tonight." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that went through several iterations. The first being the professional expectation that this would require more work. The second being the recognition that it wouldn't. And the third being something less readable. He withdrew his hands from his pockets. He did not say anything else. He went back through the door above her. She stood in the stairwell for a moment, in the concrete quiet, under the fluorescent light, and she thought about the shape of what had just happened, not with alarm, but with the analytical attention of someone cataloging new information. Kane had sent someone. Informally at this stage, which meant formally was being prepared, which meant he was not operating from a position of confidence, which meant that behind the television statement and the procedural language and the composed exterior, he was feeling the floor shift. She went down to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for approximately 45 seconds. Outside the parking structure window, the Rivergate Medical Center building was illuminated. The entrance, the Holloway wing with its name in lit letters, the administrative floors dark now, except for the light in one office on the 4th floor where someone had left a lamp on. She took the coin out of her pocket. It was warm from being carried. The engraving was barely visible in the parking structure light, the insignia that no official document had ever reproduced, the mark of a unit that had functioned for 6 years and then officially ceased to exist and then unofficially continued to matter for every person who had ever been part of it. Ryan had carried this through 7 years of operations. He had given it to Ethan on a night when he'd had a feeling, and Ethan had kept it for 4 years through his own complicated landscape of deployments and injuries and the particular burden of carrying someone else's unfinished business without knowing where to deliver it. It had come back to her. She put it back in her pocket, started the car, and drove. She was 2 blocks from the hospital, at the first light, when her phone rang. Alterman's number. At 10:50 at night. She answered. "I apologize for the hour," Alterman said, and she sounded like someone who had been awake for approximately as long as Claire had been. "Outside counsel received something in the last 30 minutes that I thought you should know about before tomorrow." "What is it?" Claire said. "Kane's personal legal team filed an emergency motion this evening," Alterman said. "They're claiming that the board's investigation was triggered by your testimony and that your testimony is compromised by—" A pause. And in the pause, Claire heard the particular quiet of someone choosing words carefully. "They're claiming your military service record contains a classified incident from 2013 that materially affects your credibility as a witness. They've submitted a sealed filing to the judge, and they're requesting that your personnel file and testimony be excluded from the investigation pending a credibility review." The light changed. She didn't move. The car behind her didn't honk. It waited. "They're going after the classification," she said. "They've somehow obtained reference to an incident. They don't have the details. It's still classified. But they have enough to name the operation by a redacted designation and argue that whatever happened in it raises questions about your—" Alterman stopped. "I don't know what they're implying. The filing is sealed, but the judge has agreed to review it." She sat at the green light. "The incident in 2013, she said slowly. "Do you know what they're referencing?" "No," Alterman said. "Do you?" She knew exactly what they were referencing, and if Victor Kane's attorneys had obtained enough information to file a sealed motion referencing a classified 2013 operation by its redacted designation, if that information was somehow in their hands, then someone had given it to them. Someone with access to records that were not, and could not be, publicly available. Someone inside. Her hands were very still on the wheel. "I need to make a call," she said. "I'll be at the board meeting at 9. She ended the call and sat in the car at the green light in the dark. And she thought about who knew about 2013. And she thought about what they knew. And she thought about what it meant that they had given that information to a suspended hospital CEO's personal legal team 12 hours after his suspension. And then she thought about Ethan Cross, who had been in the hospital all day, who had been in the lobby, in the consultation room, in the corridor, who had told her things that he had not told anyone else, and who had known, before anyone else in that building, exactly what was in her sealed service record. She did not want to think the thing she was thinking, but she thought it anyway, because thinking clearly was the only thing she knew how to do when the ground moved. She picked up the phone and called Ethan's number. It rang 4 times, and went to voicemail. She called Hayes, not Ethan. Hayes, because Hayes was the person with the clearance to understand what a sealed reference to a 2013 classified operation actually meant, and because calling Ethan again into a silent voicemail felt like standing in a doorway waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. Hayes picked up on the second ring, which told Claire she hadn't been asleep. "I heard," Hayes said before Claire could speak. "Alterman's counsel called our JAG officer 40 minutes ago." "Then you know what they're referencing." "I know exactly what they're referencing." Hayes's voice was the same register it had been all day. Even, deliberate, carrying weight without straining under it. "And I need you to listen to me carefully. What happened in 2013 is not what they're going to imply it is. The sealed filing uses a redacted operation designation and constructs an implication out of the redaction itself. They don't have the content. They have the label." Claire sat with that. "They're using the classification as the weapon. If the details are sealed, they can imply anything," Hayes said. "And the implication, that there's something in your record that compromises your credibility, doesn't need to be true to create delay. Delay is all they need. Another 3 to 5 days of procedural ambiguity, and Kane's legal team starts attacking the investigation's timeline. Can you respond to the sealed filing?" "I filed a counter-declaration with the JAG office at 9:15 tonight," Hayes said. "I anticipated this move or something like it, which is why I made certain calls before we walked into that hospital this morning." A pause. "The 2013 operation is still classified, but my declaration states on the record that I was the senior officer on that operation and that nothing in its contents reflects negatively on your conduct, your credibility, or your character. In fact," she stopped, and what followed the stop was a particular kind of quiet. "In fact, the opposite. What happened in 2013, Claire said carefully, is the reason the commendation took this long." "Yes," Hayes said simply, "because what you did in 2013 was extraordinary, and classifying it meant we couldn't recognize it. And I have spent 6 years being angry about that specific irony and doing something about it through the only channels available to me." She paused again. "The judge will see my declaration tomorrow morning. Outside counsel will have it by 7 a.m. The motion will be denied." "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," Hayes said, "but I've been building this case for a long time, and I didn't build it with gaps." Claire exhaled. "Ethan's not answering his phone." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "He's not," Hayes said carefully. "Someone you need to be concerned about. He had access to my record information all day. He knew the 2013 designation. If Kane's team..." "Ethan Cross has been under military intelligence debrief since 6 p.m., Hayes said. "Standard protocol. He's been with our people since before Kane's attorneys filed anything. His phone is on a desk in a DOD office 2 miles from the hospital." A pause. "He's not the source." She let herself believe that, because Hayes said it with the directness of someone reporting a fact and not a reassurance, and because believing the alternative required a reordering of everything she'd observed about Ethan Cross today, and she had been reading people in high-stakes situations for long enough to trust her read. "Then who?" she said. "Marcus Fry," Hayes said. "General counsel. He had full access to your personnel file, to the complaint records, and to the preliminary briefing documents that referenced your service record summary. When he left the building at 3:15, he took a copy of his own files. His access wasn't locked down fast enough." Her voice had an edge to it now. Not anger, but the specific tightness of someone noting a failure in procedure that caused a downstream problem. "That's on us. We should have moved faster." "Fry," She thought about his expression in that corridor. The man who had looked away as he walked past her through the stairwell door. The man who had signed Kane's personal legal retainer at 10 in the morning and spent the day as the institutional lubricant between Kane's actions and their consequences. "The judge will have everything by morning," Hayes said. "Go home. Sleep. Be at that meeting at 9. She ended the call and sat in the car for another 30 seconds. Outside, Ashford City was doing what cities did at 11 o'clock on a weekday, winding down without fully stopping, the lights of the medical center behind her and the ordinary lit streets ahead, and somewhere across the city Priscilla Park was probably asleep in her apartment near Harmon Memorial, and Naomi Varga was probably on her overnight shift in the ED downstairs, and Walt Prescott was running the night floor with the 11 years of steady competence that had never required anyone to pay attention to it. She started the car and drove home. The judge denied Kane's motion at 7:43 the following morning. She read about it in a text from Alterman while she was putting on her jacket, the precise formal language of a legal decision compressed into Alterman's summary. Motion denied. Hayes' declaration accepted. Investigation proceeds without exclusion. See you at 9. She put her phone in her pocket beside the coin and drove back to Rivergate. The 9 o'clock meeting was not the meeting she had expected. She had expected documents, questions, the procedural continuation of the previous day's formal review. What she walked into was something that had moved further and faster than that. Alterman sat at the head of the table, and her expression was different from yesterday's. Not the controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis, but the specific clarity of someone who has finished managing and is now in the phase that comes after. The DOH representatives were back. Outside counsel was back. Hayes was there, in uniform, her 2 officers behind her. Ethan Cross was in the chair by the wall again, Hatch at his feet. He looked at Claire when she came in and held up his phone briefly, with the expression of someone who wanted to communicate, "I saw your call, and I will explain without making a production of it." She gave him a small nod that meant, "I know," Hayes told me, "we're fine," and sat down. It took 40 minutes for the full picture to assemble itself in the room, and the picture was this. The forensic audit of Rivergate's records had expanded overnight. What began as a review of staffing patterns and complaint handling had, in the hands of outside counsel and the DOH investigators, revealed a broader architecture, one in which Kane had been systematically altering patient outcome reports tied to high donor periods, classifying adverse events in ways that reduced their regulatory visibility, and using the hospital's charitable foundation accounts to fund donor engagement expenses that were not, under any reasonable accounting interpretation, charitable in nature. It was not just arrogance, it was fraud. The DOH representatives delivered this finding with the flat professional effect of regulators who had seen institutional misconduct before and were neither surprised nor theatrical about it. Outside counsel followed with the legal framework. Alterman listened to all of it and then said without preamble, "The board voted at 7 this morning. Victor Kane is terminated, effective immediately. Marcus Fry is referred to the state bar. The board is filing a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office by end of day." The room absorbed this. The nursing staff who filed complaints in February, Naomi Varga and Priscilla Park, will be formally contacted by outside counsel today, Alterman continued. Ms. Park will be offered reinstatement at terms to be negotiated. Ms. Varga will receive a formal apology from the board and a review of her compensation and role. She paused. These are not optional outcomes. The board has committed to them in writing. Claire looked at the table. She thought about Priscilla Park's attorney receiving that call. She thought about the weight of what it meant to have filed a complaint, been dismissed, been moved, and then eventually, a year and a half later, through the specific catalyzing friction of one morning, been told that someone in authority had gone back and read what you wrote and decided it was true. It was not a perfect outcome. It was late and imperfect, and insufficient in the way that late justice was always somewhat insufficient. But it was real. Ms. Bennett, Alterman said. She looked up. The board would like to offer you reinstatement effective today with full back pay for the period of wrongful termination and a formal written apology entered into the record. She held Claire's gaze. We would also like to discuss a role that goes beyond your current position. a clinical leadership advisory role focused on emergency care standards and staffing policy. We're not asking you to stop being a nurse. We're asking you to help us make sure that what happened here doesn't happen again." The room was quiet. She thought about Gerald Marsh asking for the person who had stayed. She thought about Arthur Devereaux's blood pressure and the dressing observation and the 6 minutes that Gaines had characterized as the difference between one room and another. She thought about Walt Prescott filing his 4th complaint with the DOH directly, the specific act of a man who had been ignored 3 times and had decided that the 4th time he was going to try a different door. She thought about what it would mean to have standing, actual institutional standing, to make the argument for adequate staffing and clinical priority in a room where the people who made decisions about those things were required to listen. "Yes," she said. Hayes found her in the corridor afterward, outside the conference room, in the ordinary fluorescent quiet of the 2nd floor. "There's a formal ceremony," Hayes said, "for the commendation. Next month at the Naval Station in Devlin Point. I know that's not—" "I'll be there," Claire said. Hayes looked at her. Something moved in her expression, the specific emotion of someone who has been working toward a moment for a long time and is standing in it and is not entirely sure what to do with themselves now that it's arrived. He would have been insufferably proud of himself for orchestrating all of this, Hayes said. Meaning Ryan. The specific, affectionate exasperation of someone who had cared about a person and found their style difficult and was going to miss it for the rest of their life. He orchestrated nothing, Claire said. He left a coin with a man who had the sense to find me. He knew Ethan would find you. He counted on it. Hayes paused. He counted on you being exactly where you were, doing exactly what you were doing. She had no answer for that wasn't already obvious, so she didn't offer one. Hayes extended her hand. Not a salute, a handshake, the kind between two people who have been in adjacent difficulties for a long time and are acknowledging it without ceremony. Claire shook it, and Hayes went down the corridor toward the elevator, and that was that. She went upstairs. Not to the boardroom, not to the administrative wing. Upstairs, to the 3rd floor, to the ICU, to the floor that she had walked onto at 6 a.m. yesterday as one kind of person and was returning to now as a slightly different configuration of the same person, carrying the same skills and the same habits, and the same imperfect human capacity for doing the work. Tomas was at the nursing station, updating a chart. He saw her come through the unit doors and said nothing, but his expression said everything it needed to say. Danny was coming out of room 6 with a medication tray, and when she saw Claire, she stopped. And then she walked over and, without any preamble, without the verbal apparatus that people usually constructed around these moments, put her arms around her for approximately 3 seconds, and then stepped back and cleared her throat and said, "Gerald Marsh has been asking about you every 2 hours." "I'll go see him," Claire said. She passed room 7, where Arthur Devereaux was sleeping with the even respiratory pattern of someone whose body had found stable ground, the monitoring leads doing their steady reporting work. She passed the medication room, the supply alcove, the desk where Walt Prescott had worked through the night, and left notes in his precise handwriting for the day shift team. She pushed open the door to room 4. Gerald Marsh was awake. He was sitting slightly upright, and his color was better. The gray-yellow was gone, replaced by something closer to his own face, the face of a living person rather than someone hovering at the margin between states. His daughter was in the chair beside him, and she looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had made a phone call yesterday that she did not regret. "There she is," Gerald said. The same words as yesterday, the same rough voice, but with more air in them now. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Better than yesterday," which isn't saying much, but I'll take it. He watched her settle into the chair across from Pauline. "I heard about the meeting. Word travels fast in hospitals. Pauline has a source." He glanced at his daughter with the look of a man who found this both unsurprising and entirely characteristic. "Is it done?" "The investigation is ongoing," she said. "That takes time, but the immediate—" "Yes, it's done." He nodded and was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the way of someone who has a thing to say and is deciding how to say it without it coming out larger than intended. "I've had a lot of nurses over the years," he said finally. "Hospital visits, procedures, the whole long production of getting old. Most of them were good. Some of them were excellent. He stopped. You stayed in that room. I did my job, she said, and she meant it the same way she'd meant it every time she'd said it. Not modestly, not deflecting, just accurately. She had done her job. The job had required staying, so she had stayed. Your job, Gerald said, apparently involved a lot more than this floor knew about. Most people's jobs involve more than the floor knows about. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." She held that. Not the way you hold something you're dismissing, but the way you hold something that has weight and deserves to be acknowledged before you put it down. "You're going to be okay," she said. He smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. The smile of a man who has been frightened and has come through it and is now simply, quietly, glad to be on the right side of it. "I know," he said. "I believe you." She stepped out of room 4 into the corridor and stood for a moment in the familiar hum of the ICU, the monitors, the climate control, the distant sound of a phone at the nursing station being answered, the footsteps of people doing the continuous, unglamorous, essential work of keeping other people alive. The light in the corridor was the same light it had always been. The floor tile was the same floor tile. Nothing about the space had changed. Everything about who she was in it had clarified. She had spent 10 years carrying the weight of work that couldn't be named in a pocket in the form of a worn brass coin, alongside all the other weights that don't get named, the 11 people whose names she now had on a declassified document, the shifts she'd worked in this hospital and the ones before it, the 3 times she'd been passed over for charge nurse consideration and not asked why, the 6 scheduling adjustments she'd absorbed without understanding their origin, the accumulated quiet cost of being someone whose full dimension went unrecognized by every room she walked into. She was not a different person for having been recognized. That was the thing about recognition. It didn't create what was already there. It just stopped requiring you to carry it alone. The coin was in her pocket. It would stay there. Not as evidence, not as a symbol anyone else needed to see, but because Ryan had carried it for 7 years and Ethan had carried it for 4, and now it was hers again, and some things you just carry because they belong to you. She thought about what it costs to stay in a room when someone tells you to leave. Not the dramatic cost, not the career risk and the public humiliation and the board investigation, but the smaller daily cost, the one that accumulates across years of being in institutions that measure your worth by metrics that have nothing to do with what you actually do. The cost of knowing what you're capable of and having no official language for it. The cost of doing the right thing in a room where no one is watching and no one will know. She had paid that cost for a long time. She had not always paid it gracefully. She had been frustrated and tired, and on certain mornings she had sat in her car in the same parking structure and felt the specific dull weight of not being seen by a place she was working very hard for. But she had stayed in the room. That was the whole of it, really. You stay in the room. Not because someone is watching. Not because the record will reflect it, not because the institution will recognize it. You stay in the room because there is a person in the bed who needs you to stay, and because you are someone who does not leave when the work is not finished, and because that quality, that specific, unglamorous, entirely human quality, is not created by a commendation or a board decision or a Navy ceremony at a base in Devlin Point. It was there long before any of that. It would be there long after. She straightened her badge on her jacket. Claire Bennett, RN, ICU, and walked back to the nursing station where Tomas and Danny were waiting, and she picked up the first chart, and she went to work. There was nothing seamless about the days that followed. The investigation was long and procedurally tedious, and there were depositions and document reviews and at least 3 occasions where she sat in a room with outside counsel for 2 hours answering the same questions in different framings, and it was exhausting in the specific way of legal processes, which extracted their costs in time and repetition rather than drama. Victor Kane's termination was followed 6 weeks later by a referral from the State Attorney General's office for investigation into the foundation accounts. Marcus Fry surrendered his bar license before the disciplinary hearing concluded, which was the institutional equivalent of a man who knows exactly what the evidence says, deciding not to make everyone sit through it. Priscilla Park came back to Rivergate on her own terms, into a restructured ED role with a title that actually reflected what she did. Naomi Varga received the formal apology in writing and framed it, she told Danny, not for the sentiment, but because she wanted to be able to look at proof that she had not been wrong. Walt Prescott's fourth complaint, the one filed with the DOH directly on the afternoon of the worst day Rivergate had had in years, became part of the regulatory citation that required the hospital to implement a mandatory independent clinical review process for all staffing decisions affecting high-acuity units. He attended the implementation meeting with the expression of a man who had been waiting 11 years for the right door and had finally found it. The ceremony at Devlin Point Naval Station happened on a Thursday in late autumn. It was formal and cold, and the kind of brief that military ceremonies tended to be when the substance of what was being recognized was too significant for elaboration. Hayes presented the commendation. Ethan Cross was there in his dress uniform, 2 weeks post-surgery, standing straighter than his surgeon had recommended and pointedly ignoring the discomfort. He had, she had learned, been the one to push the final review request that triggered the declassification. He had filed it 18 months earlier and had not told anyone, because he was not the kind of person who mentioned things he'd done until they were done. She stood in the cold at Devlin Point with the commendation in her hands and the coin in her pocket, and 11 names on a declassified document, and she thought about a 23-year-old in a different kind of uniform, in a different kind of situation, making decisions in seconds that she could not explain to anyone, because the explanation required context she was not permitted to provide. She thought, someone was always watching, not the institution, not the record, the person beside her, and the one she was keeping alive, and the one who came after, carrying a message 4 years across the distance between a last mission and a hospital lobby. On her first morning in the new advisory role, she arrived at 6 a.m. and went to the ICU before the administrative offices opened, because the administrative offices could wait and the floor couldn't, and because she was a nurse first and the title was a tool in service of that, not the other way around. She pulled a chair beside the bed of a woman who had come in overnight, frightened, post-procedure, asking the questions that people asked when they were scared, and the clinical language wasn't translating into something they could hold on to. Claire sat down. She looked at her directly. "Here's what's happening," she said. "Here's what we're watching for. Here's what the numbers mean." She said it plainly, without the softening that sometimes became condescension, without the reassurance that sometimes became dishonesty. She said it the way she had said things to people in worse situations, in darker places, when the truth was the only thing either of them had. The woman's breathing slowed. Her hands unclenched slightly. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Thank you." Claire stayed until the morning round arrived. Then she stood up, straightened her badge, and went to do the rest of the work. The entire hospital, by then, knew exactly who was walking the floor. And for the first time, that knowledge was in every room she entered before she arrived. Not as a warning, not as a credential to be evaluated, but as a simple, settled, institutional fact. She was the nurse who stayed. She had always been.